Hadass Gold is a media reporter for Politico. Steve Shigaris is our CBS News political director. And I have to admit to both of you that yesterday I was sort of in a state of shock and a little bit of confusion, trying to wrap my head around exactly what was happening. So I figured let me go home and sleep on it. Maybe I'll wake up on Friday morning and I'll be able to make better sense of it. But I have not been able to do that. Not so well. And Hadass, let's start with the sort of the media aspect of this. How is this playing out in the media 24 hours or so later?
It's still a huge story. We're still getting a lot of attention on it. It was that has taken the story further with this National Enquirer story that apparently was written in early June about the relationship between Mika and Joe, that a White House advisor, which now is being named as Jared Kushner, told Joe Scarborough that if he wanted that story killed, he would have to apologize to the president, and then the president would call his good friend David Pecker, the publisher of the National Enquirer, and would get that story to not be published. Obviously, that story was published in the end. This is just continuing to go on down with pretty much Joe and Mika almost accusing the president of his staff of blackmail.
And that is in regards to this idea that if he doesn't call the National Enquirer, if he doesn't call the president and apologize, that story, that supposedly damaging story, is going to end up in the National Enquirer. All right, so from a political standpoint today, with these sort of new accusations, Steve, how is that part of it playing out?
Well, again, it overshadows all the other stuff that he's been trying to do as president in terms of policy, in terms of legislatively. We're talking about things that that really are distractions, and this has been his MO since he's jumped into this race, since he jumped into the race in June of 2015, throughout his campaign and now throughout his presidency. Anytime there are other things that they want to talk about, whether it's Energy Week this week or whether it's immigration bills that he wanted Congress to pass, that the House passed yesterday, those things are overshadowed by Russia investigation, by the firing of Jim Comey, by tweeting out about Mika Brzezinski. And, you know, you even had people out there yesterday, people who are supporters of the president, vocal supporters of the president, saying, "What, you got to cut this out." I mean, they used the example of the House passing these immigration bills yesterday as a day where the president should have had a victory lap with the media. This is something that he was pushing, he's been talking about throughout the campaign. The House passed those bills and no one cared. Why? Because we're all talking about a tweet that he sent at 8:59 yesterday morning.
Hadass, as someone who lived in New York City in the 90s and the early 2000s, I mean, sort of watching Donald Trump try to manipulate the tabloids and to try to work all of these different things into the way that he's now governing the country, it seems very familiar. This is the way that he used to operate as a real estate mogul in New York City, and the stories of him calling and, you know, using a nom de plume to try to plant positive stories about himself, you know, over the years in the tabloids in New York are very familiar at this point. I mean, this all seems like it's, you know, sort of a pattern of behavior that he's carrying over from his years in New York.
Right, people who know Donald Trump from before, and even anybody who's covered his campaign or watched his campaign, this is nothing new. And people thought that once he becomes president, he would somehow become more presidential. He'd honestly be too busy running the country to pay attention to things like this. But clearly this isn't true. This is a man who has for the past 70 years lived this way, and he's not going to be changing anytime soon, as his staff and his press secretaries have been very clear about. This is who he is, and when he gets punched, he punches back 5 times harder, although it's been described as though the proper response might have been a fly swatter, and instead he brings a bazooka. And politically, when you're looking at this as somebody, he started this week with a really great week for him and for his supporters, with CNN retracting a story that linked one of his campaign officials with some Russian investment bank. That they were riding high about that. The White House was so happy about that type of story. It perfectly played into the argument that any story about Russia is quote unquote fake news. And he has completely scuttled that argument right now, because now all we're talking about is Mika and Joe and these horrible tweets that he's sending out, that he's getting condemnation, even as we were saying before, from some of his greatest supporters, such as Sean Hannity on Fox News, conceded on the radio yesterday that it wasn't smart, it wasn't helpful in any way.
But it seems as though he can't control himself, Steve. You know, obviously he knows that this is probably not the smartest thing in the world, but if he could stop himself, wouldn't he do that?
you would think, I think back, and it's not, people are trying to make a judgment about him and his character, and it's interesting because it's not like we haven't had presidents who have maybe had, issues that maybe not similar, but questionable issues about their personality. You listen to tapes of LBJ, you listen to tapes of Richard Nixon. The difference is they didn't have an iPhone in their hands. They weren't tweeting their thoughts. They either had another way to vent, and it wasn't so public. We found out about this stuff years later. Someone's going to figure out a way to take this thing out of his hands, or at least figure out a way to get somebody next to him so the president can just vent about these things and not vent to him to 31 million Twitter followers, because every time he tweets these things, it turns into something that not only overshadows whatever storyline they're trying to push out, but it really, it has his colleagues, his Republican colleagues on the Hill asking questions about how long are we going to have to deal with this guy. It may not be a problem in terms of getting the things he wants to get done, but it's just a distraction, and it's something that we have to find ourselves answering questions about on a weekly basis that really is something it's pretty easy to figure out. Put the Twitter down.
Hadass, I was listening very closely to Mika Brzezinski this morning, and there's one thing she said that stuck out to me, and that is that watching the president's behavior just shows how easily played he is. And so as we see him standing there side by side with the president of South Korea, as we think about him negotiating with senators, lawmakers up on the Hill, working towards a health care bill, working towards tax reform, infrastructure, you name it. I just wonder if that is the message that his political opponents and maybe some of his allies are taking away from this, is that he's easily played.
The really interesting aspect of this is how other countries are taking a look at this, and how especially our adversaries are looking at this, and how they're putting that into their intelligence files on our president, how they might be able to use that in their favor or to try to get some deal with the United States or something. We already kind of saw this play out in Saudi Arabia when Donald Trump went to visit, and his face was plastered all over these big billboards, and it was a very celebratory, as though a king was coming to visit. And granted, countries do that for presidents all the time, but that is something to keep in mind, as to this is like a living diary of this current president. Normally we don't get this sort of insight into what really ticks him off and what gets him going. I mean, this, as we were saying before, this week could have been a very good week. There was a lot of other things he could have been tweeting about. In fact, I still think it was this week that they put out this really intense statement about Syria and about a possible chemical attack. But I don't remember us talking about that, or us talking about maybe if that had somehow prevented innocent lives from being taken. Instead, what we're talking about is this, and some people think that he's playing 4D chess. That's what a lot of his supporters think is going on. But in terms of what Republicans on Capitol Hill do, yes, they do have to continue responding to it, but ultimately, are they going to actually stand up and stop anything from happening and stand up to this president? It's not clear, because they also want their agenda to be passed. So this is a big question for Republicans right now, and who we're also not talking about is the Democrats and how they handle all this.
Well, we mentioned the president of South Korea, who of course is in Washington today, and the president just held high-stakes meetings with him. And in a joint statement, he addressed ongoing tensions with North Korea. Let's take a listen to that.
The United States calls on other regional powers and all responsible nations to join us in implementing sanctions and demanding that the North Korean regime choose a better path and do it quickly, and a different future for its long-suffering people. Our goal is peace, stability, and prosperity for the region. But the United States will defend itself, always will defend itself, always. And we will always defend our allies. As part of that commitment, we are working together to ensure fair burden sharing in support of the United States military presence in South Korea.
So the president there staying on message and talking about the ongoing tensions with North Korea. Yesterday at the White House, Steve, we heard Sarah Sanders say this is kind of like the Twilight Zone. And here it is sort of playing out again today. You have a president conducting foreign policy with the sort of umbrella hanging over the White House, the cloud of the tweets and the Morning Joe stuff. How effective can he be on a world stage while also dealing with these other side matters?
Well, these are real issues. These are bigger issues, and they're going to go on regardless of what the president tweets about and what people are reacting to, how people are reacting to his tweets. And what's interesting in this case of North Korea is that you see the United States and South Korea sort of going in opposite directions on this. The previous South Korea president was a hardliner against North Korea, while President Obama had this sort of idea of strategic patience. Well, now President Trump said, just before that clip that you played, said the era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. For many years it has failed, and that patience is over. And now the current South Korean president, who you see, is actually taking a more softer stance on this and talking about potentially engaging with North Korea. So there's a bit of a split between the president and South Korean president on this. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they move forward. South Korean president mentioned he's invited President Trump to South Korea later this year, and President Trump has accepted that. So again, these things go on. You're going to see President Trump go overseas next week. You're going to see him go to South Korea. He can tweet all he wants, but these issues are going to be dealt with, and it's going to be interesting to watch how this one moves forward.
So that's the world stage, Hadass, domestically, and you were talking about this a moment ago when it comes to Democrats and Republicans on the Hill and the health care debate. Mitch McConnell, of course, had hoped to get a new language and a bill passed by now. Obviously, that's not happening. What do you think? How do you think this all plays out, again, with the sideshow that's taking on involving the president's social media activity?
What was really interesting was to watch as this was unfolding. Some of these Republican senators that are really important to get this health care bill passed came out and were really angry about these tweets, like Senator Collins. They were really condemning them. And these are people that the president needs to be on his side and to be supportive of him and of this bill. And even though they're not necessarily connected, these tweets about a female cable host and a health care bill, you often need that sort of just the general goodwill in order to help get things passed. And for somebody who claims to be such a wonderful deal maker, it's probably not very helpful to your big deal to have somebody that you need on your side to come out so against you on something else. How would some of these senators then want to negotiate with this president and with his allies on Capitol Hill if they have to deal with this sideshow on the side? It's just not helpful to anything. And other than maybe making his base supporters happy or making President Trump feel personally happy, it just is absolutely no positives to him, and it doesn't seem as though anybody can convince him otherwise.
Hadass, I always enjoy your work in Politico. Nice to talk to you today. Steve, always good to talk to you as well. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.